Hello and welcome to the Racial Equity webinar series. I'm Kinkini Banerjee, the Coalition Relations Director at USBC, and I'm so glad to have you join us for this session. This webinar series is hosted with funding support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the purpose of this series is to increase our collective understanding about social and racial justice, equity, and inclusion, and strengthen our capacity to develop and implement policies and practices that improve access, dignity, equity, and justice. Our webinars are designed for participants at various levels of knowledge and awareness and readiness to apply the concepts of equity to maternal and child health work. And we hope that these sessions bring you ideas and inspiration to collaborate and co-design more impactful and inclusive programs, policies, and practices. I hope you're a member of our Racial Equity online learning community, and if not, this is a great time to join. This learning community is a forum to discuss issues around equity and inclusion within the reproductive health and justice field. We share resources and ideas and learn from each other. So if you're not part of the community, please consider joining today. We have, like I said, we have a webinar on odd-numbered months. We share resources, materials that come with the webinar, but also throughout the time through this group. And there's also, this is a great way to curate and ask questions that you might be experiencing in your work and life with advancing equity. Our file library is also rich with readings, so we'd love for you to access what we have, but also add to our library, because we're always wanting to look for new material and how we could all learn. So this is how you go to our webpage. Under About Us, if you go to our diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can see the page, and that is where our racial equity learning community is, as well as our webinar. We have archives of all of the previous webinars. You can click on those and access previous webinars as well. We have a large number of participants today, so the participants are in listen-only mode. The recordings with all of the handouts are posted. Here's the link for the Racial Equity Learning Community, as well as the page for our webinars. This should also be in the email that you got, which confirmed your registration. So it's www.usbreastfeeding.org/equity-community. And during today's session, our attendees are in listen-only mode because we have a large number of attendees, but we want to make this as interactive as possible. So our presenter will be asking a couple of questions during the course of the presentation session today. So we invite you to use the questions box and type in your comments. And then also, as any questions or comments come up for you during the presentation, please feel free to share those with us. The questions can be submitted at any time during the webinar. And here's how you do it. You should see a control panel to the right of your screen. If it's minimized, click on that orange tab with the white arrow and it'll pop back out. And just under the audio section is a tab that says questions. Click on that tab and it'll open up a text box for you to type it. We don't have a chat function, so when we ask you questions during this session, please use the question box as well, and we will either unmute your lines or we will read your questions, your comments from the chat box. During the session, if you have any audio or other technical issues, please email office@usbreastfeeding.org and our staff should be able to help you. And that brings me to today's topic, confronting implicit bias within ourselves. We know we've all done this about securing our own masks before helping others. We've either ignored the flight attendant's safety instructions before liftoff, glazing over the advice they give us on using the oxygen mask. For those who might miss those critical instructions explaining why we always need to secure our own mask before helping others during an emergency, we know that we need to do that so that we are not too disoriented or weak to help anyone else. Similarly, implicit bias influences one's thoughts and actions very much like the allegory that's been used by our presenter. Support professionals selflessly serve others without addressing our own needs first, and sometimes the lack of personal awareness of implicit bias can make our attempts to be helpful just the opposite, causing more harm rather than improving the situation. And so this concept of securing one's own mask can be applied to many topics in today's society, especially those related to structural barriers, racism. Researchers have found that the more we ignore and disguise our racial biases, the more likely we are to perpetuate them. During today's presentation, we will hear how structural racism is held up by both explicit and implicit biases. We will discover how structural racism is a system that we all inherited and why it is now, although we might not have had a big role in creating it, it's our responsibility to change it. And we will learn how to perform critical self-assessments of ourselves to identify some of our implicit biases. We hope that this discovery will help us and help others, that you will be, and that we will all be able to use these tools to dismantle systems of structural racism and to advance true and meaningful inclusion and equity within our workplaces, our organizations, and our life. I'm so honored to introduce today's presenter. Felicia Brooks Floyd is a founding member and president of the National Association of Professional and Peer Lactation Supporters of Color on NAPLC. Felicia is a former USPC board member and a member of CRASH, and I can't say enough about how her guidance has improved and strengthened USPC's governance practices, from making our nominations more transparent and accountable to board processes, to really making us look at how pernicious and invisible culture can be in creating barriers. So through her work, through her work on our CRASH committee, she's been invaluable in so many ways. Felicia is also a leader with the Florida Breastfeeding Coalition, an active member with the Florida Lactation Consultants Association. She's an IBCLC with degrees in public service and psychology, and has worked for over a decade in community-based healthcare, ranging from healthcare to WIC-based community support. Currently, Felicia works for a hospital health system overseeing the day-to-day operations of the lactation program of over 4 departments. And she also helps families to breastfeed in her private practice called Beyond Breastfeeding. Felicia was a member of the first food cohort at the Center for Social Inclusion and is a valuable member of USBC, continues to be a valuable member of USBC's leadership community. She was honored by the USBC with the inaugural Legacy Award in 2014. She wears so many hats. She's the creator of the social media and online community breastfeeding support group, affectionately known as the Blacktivist, and empowers efforts to help increase breastfeeding rates in the African American community. Felicia is a proud active duty Air Force military spouse and a grateful mother of 3 exclusive breastfed children. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Felicia. Welcome, Felicia.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Kenny. It's so wonderful to be In the spirit of my fellow USBC advocates, thank you for having NAPLC present to you today. Today, we're going to discuss securing your own mask before helping others, confronting implicit biases within ourselves. I travel quite a bit, and I tend to hear this every single time I get on the flight, and I'm sure many of you do as well. But however, during those instructions that are always given each flight, I tend to kind of doze off, get on my phone, not really pay attention. And I was wondering how many of us do this in everyday life? These are life-saving instructions. And although we hear it, how many of us could really apply it when the time is ready? Because we so many times just continue on about our day and ignore these vital instructions to secure our own mask before helping others. So as we dissect this, I want us to learn more and get more information about how to look into that, securing our own mask before helping others. For example, in everyday practices, how can we sit with our thoughts, sit with our discomfort, and understand that we're bringing a lot of our own biases to the table when we're supporting communities that are at risk. Let's see, I'm trying to... So the National Association of Professional and Peer Lactation Supporters of Color formed out of a mode of survival. Many times, so as we see in everyday settings, things are done for us without us. And what the common proverb says, things that are done for us without us are really not for us. So a group of us decided to really organize and show strength and support and really come together to strengthen our skills and our support level and cultivate a community that will transform policies and practices and skilled lactation care to decrease barriers and also increase awareness about the skill sets and the things that are needed for communities of color to serve with cultural humility and to also support other professionals. These are our board members currently, and Stacey Davis is currently our executive director. She's not able to be with us today, but she's with us in spirit. And I believe Cammie and Andrea, as well as Brenda, has also spoken on the webinars at some point. This is my family that really encourages me and are my whys. I like to think that my breastfeeding relationship kind of started in a form of resiliency. I was offered the shot 17 years ago now, 18 years ago now, to dry my milk up without any information about breastfeeding when I was about 35 weeks pregnant. And I did not understand why that happened. When I have grown to realize since then, being in the field of maternal child health, that was a result of systemic racism. If I hadn't asked what this shot is for, my OBGYN at the time would have just gladly given it to me, and it would have not only dried up my milk supply prematurely before giving birth, but also statistically that shot has now been rendered not approved by the FDA. However, once I realized that this breast milk is best for my child, that's really all I needed to encourage me to at least try breastfeeding. I was discouraged by family members because of the trauma that's happened in our family where breastfeeding was not continued for generations. So this, of course, really gave me the fuel to attempt to breastfeed, and I was able to breastfeed my 3 children that you see here and continue to help others breastfeed. And it really transformed my career with those experiences and professional impact that it's made to want to help other families and other folks in this field recognize that I too, and we all have probably been a victim of the system that has been set up generations before us. I want to take this time to give a sincere thanks to the Center for Social Inclusion, formerly. It's now known as Race Forward, and Simran Noor, who was our instructor for the first food equity cohort. That was a grant-funded program where 16 individuals were selected nationally after applying to take part in an 18-month cohort to basically change and understand structural barriers and institutional barriers and systemic racism, and have these tools that we'll present today to go forth and try to change the status quo and change policies and systems and practices, and realizing it's much deeper than individual reflection. So I'm going to take this 3 minutes now to really highlight my fellow cohort leaders and this program, and why this, not only the series that USBC is doing is so imperative, but why the work that each and every one of you do is so important. And Miriam, would you mind uploading that YouTube video, please?
You might need to unmute your line, Miriam.
First food is that is life. That's the nourishment of life. We're talking about the foundation for our community's health. It's the first preventative act that we can do for our babies and for our mothers. African American infant mortality rates are amongst the highest, 2 times those of white babies. We know breastfeeding is something that can address the vitality of an infant and bring about that first year of life and beyond.
A generation ago, I didn't have that experience with my mother or with my grandmother. My mom's story, when she delivered me at the hospital, she was given pills to dry up her milk. So my first food was probably Carnation or Nestle formula or something. Breastfeeding had always been something that was important to me because it's something that I saw my sister do. And this is from a family that really had stopped breastfeeding. When you immigrate to the United States, you want to take on American ways. It's about reclaiming traditions. It's about self-determination. It's about building community. I began to see how people of color were treated differently and how the resources were not going into communities when it comes to support during pregnancy and then support after having the baby.
It's very important in regard not only to breastfeeding, but just health in general and health equity in general, that it's really important to have that racial equity lens.
Moving away from disparities and diversity and really talking about inequities and structural racism.
There are sometimes it's very good, they're very smart and stuff like that, but it doesn't get to the people that it should go.
Like, I see things more and it angers me more and makes me want to do more.
I mean, I think it's eventually that all the hospitals will be.
In general, the lactation field has been by white women for white women, and that doesn't work for communities of color. So I obviously want to see a field that is reflective of our country. At least 50% of the breastfeeding field should be people of color. That is where we'll really start to see changes in who's breastfeeding.
I'm convinced that I'm doing this work for my great-grandmothers and all the elders in the community who was stripped of the opportunity to breastfeed and who didn't breastfeed. I'm doing it for mamas and the babies. I'm doing it for my community, communities of color. I'm doing it for our next generation, our current generation. Like, that's who this work is for.
Thank you so much, Miriam. So as we marinate on that powerful video, it is available on YouTube, but I do like to highlight my sister leaders in the field that is also doing this imperative work, as well as so many others. And I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to learn and to continue being a lifelong learner from those ladies. So before we start, because we do know that anytime we talk about race, anytime we talk about inequities, sometimes this can bring forth a discomfort. So I like to start with just rules of engagement. I just ask that you all just stay engaged, experience the discomfort that may come up, and it's a part of the process, and understand that we cannot grow from comfortable places. Expect and accept non-closure, because we do know it's not going to be resolved in one webinar time frame in an hour. This is a lifetime generational work. I often say my goal is to work myself out of a job so that my great-great-great-grandchildren would never have to talk about disparities, inequities, and maternal child health and breastfeeding rates. Assume best intentions and ask clarifying questions. Again, this is going to come up later when we discuss biases and why that's important. And instead of assuming what folks mean or what you may interpret it as, clarifying questions are imperative. Honor your own emotions. Every time I do a presentation about inequities or racial disparities, I really have to take time out to honor my emotions. You can ask anyone that speaks on racial inequities and cultural humility. It is very draining work, but it is our responsibility to continue to change it. And so with you all, I just encourage you to honor where you're at on your journey and continue to work, do the work and the heavy lifting that's going to take to change some of these statistics and biases that we see. Also listen for understanding. So many times we listen and we listen to respond. So listen, absorb, and let this marinate and take it back to your everyday practices to help change the system. So racial inequities, diversity, inclusion, sometimes we hear these words so much it could be very illusion, it can be lost. Just like those instructions that we hear on an airplane, like, oh my goodness, are we really talking about this again? So many times when I'm presenting, I'll hear groans or, oh, are we still talking about race? Or why do we keep having to revisit this subject? And it kind of becomes dulled. And I wanted to present this because we do know that just like that mask that can save our lives if there's an emergency in an airplane, these tools, these skills are imperative when it comes to practices and policies. And they also could be life-saving when it comes to communities of color. And we want to honor that. And we want to make sure that our understanding is deeper than individual, that it impacts systems, it impacts communication, it impacts board governance, it impacts funding even, it impacts evaluation, and how we respond to others and the service that we give to others. It always centers down to racial disparities, inequities, and diversity. So we don't want it to get lost in the sauce, for a sense. We want to honor this every time and pay close attention. And we want to try to make sure and ask ourselves, are we really practicing this every day in our practices? We do know that, according to research, that race is a predictor of how well you do in education, criminal justice, health, jobs, environment, housing, culture, and arts. Race is a determinant factor in that. I want to ask you all a question, and feel free to respond in the question response or the chat box, and we'll read some of your answers out loud. And I want you to be honest with yourself. Again, this is a shared opportunity for learning. When was the last time you thought about your race?
Please use the chat or the question box to share your answers, and we'll read those out.
And I'll propose another question to you as well. When was the first time you thought about your race or the color of your skin?
So we are seeing questions from a month ago, yesterday to always. It's something I'm constantly reminded of. Someone says in high school, someone says every 10 minutes. Yeah, yesterday in a conversation, but really all the time. Someone says maybe like in the 3rd grade. One says when I was 16 years old. I was able to see it all the time, every single day, constantly. When I first emigrated to the United States, I did not think about race before I did, was one of the answers.
Powerful. And I would like for us to all to think about those answers and how it impacts our everyday life. I can tell you from walking through this world as a Black woman, there's not a moment that goes by that I don't think about my race. However, I do realize I actually just had a conversation with a colleague who was white, and she said that, you know, she never thought about how she walks through the world. She never realized that when she gets pulled over, that she's not going to get home anything other than safe. And that's a drastic difference. And those that are around you, those white folks that might be listening to this call that may have people of color that they are close to or they feel comfortable asking, I want you to propose this question to them and ask yourself truthfully the same question. And I can guarantee you that people of color will instantly know the answer to this, whereas sometimes it takes a minute for white folks to think about when was the first time that they thought about or had to think about the color of their skin or the way they walk through the world. Think about anything we fill out, just like this pertains to this slide and how it asks about race. That's the number one question. We have to honor that color exists. We can't go through this world colorblind because this impacts and race impacts how our babies live, how our babies eat, how our mothers die, and how we live. With that being said, I want everyone to understand that for terms of for purpose of this presentation, we are centered in a U.S. context, although we do know Black is global, anti-Black is global, the darker the skin. That's a global concept. We do know colonizers and colonization has happened to each country. For purposes of this presentation, we want to understand that race is a social construct, is not biologically determined, despite what many folks believe. Race is also an idea that is determined by, it changes what race is, as we know in the history of the US, that has constantly changed. We do know policy drives social construct of race and how that contributes to race over time. And I want us all to make sure that we center in the fact that we did not choose this system, but it's our responsibility to address it and do something about it, starting today if you haven't started already. For communities of colors, race is disproportionately the determination of how our health is impacted. We do know that there's a difference in gaps that are driven by race. And even saying the word race, according to research done by CSI, if we hook ourselves up to an EKG our heart rate immediately goes faster just by saying the word race. So that's how uncomfortable the tensions are when talking about it. But that's also why it's important that we continue to talk about it. Think about how you feel when others talk about race or when you talk about race. Just like I explained how I feel when I'm talking about race. That in itself says a lot of how we've been impacted by all of us, not only people of color, have been impacted by the systems of race and understanding what to do with that. So we do know that racism can be explicit and implicit. Our government, for example, we have very explicit terms when discussing race in the history of our United States, where it was Black folks had to sit on the back of the bus, the Trail of Tears, even as recent as some legislative changing in some states, such as Alabama, where it's explicit. However, for the majority of the time with our policies and practices and our laws, it became implicit. Although many times folks look at laws and different institutions as a race-neutral territory, we do know that that's not the case, that it became implicit and it continues to perpetuate, in which we see the system and the statistics that we see every day. Just recently, we do realize, even here in the state of Florida, for instance, those of you that are familiar with me, I've talked about it all the time. We just passed where our folks that were felons can now vote, and just with no requirements. And just recently, because of the implicit structures that are happening, they're trying to push that folks that were felons who were voted, who were by 65% voted, said that they can now be restored, are saying now that you have to pay a poll tax, for instance, or pay back your court fees in order to be able to vote. So this is an example of systemic racism and how it impacts. It's implicit, it doesn't say that, but we do know disproportionately what the prison system looks like and what that's going to look like with the voting changes. So paying attention to that. A personal example, an individual example of how racism impacts is the medical treatment of Black women. We do know that communities of colors are disproportionately treated differently when it comes to the system. Serena Williams, who is, again, a brilliant athlete, she had her daughter I guess her daughter's about a year old now, but she spoke out about how she was treated in the hospital. This is an athlete that is very familiar with her body, conditioned to pay close attention to every aspect that she's feeling in order to perform her optimum performance in tennis. While she was in the hospital, she was caned, and she knew something wasn't right. So she requested her medical doctors give her her nurse and her medical doctors give her a CT scan with contrast and a heparin drip, because she knew her history of blood clots. However, she was not listened to. The nurse mistook her complaints and her pain as just her being delusional due to her pain. The nurse then put in an ultrasound order. And Serena Williams became very upset because she said, I do not need an ultrasound. I need a CT scan with contrast and a heparin drip. The ultrasound, as suspected, showed up nothing. And then it was then that the doctors listened to her, and she was given the CT scan, which showed blood clots in her lungs that were settled, and which she received a heparin drip. Now, imagine if we didn't have but seconds, as we do know, with the maternal morbidity rates, that this could have turned out very differently. And this is a celebrity. This is a billionaire. And it all boils down to biases in medical treatment of Black women. Another example is Keisha Knight Pulliam. She is a child star and an actress of The Cosby Show. And her experience with delivering her child, again, another celebrity, She stated that she was only given options by her lactation provider for WIC programs and that it was assumed that she didn't have insurance. And she also stated that the lactation provider acted as if she didn't want to touch her or be close to her and her baby. And she definitely felt like that the color of her skin was the drive of that. Keisha also went on to explain that she has no problems with WIC. She thinks it's a great program. However, if this option was given to her in a list of community resources and other opportunities available for support, she wouldn't have been so offended. But again, because of biases that were experienced or acted upon by the lactation provider, Keisha was plain and simple discriminated against. And these are celebrities, and these are folks that have privileges and that have insurance. Think about how folks of color walk through this world in medical facilities and private practices, in the grocery store, in the mall, and how they are treated. And they don't even have the privileges or the statuses as these two celebrities. So again, this happens all the time. And these are just two stories to highlight because of their fame. And we want to be careful that we are not the providers that are being implicit and acted upon it and discriminated against people of color, specifically Black women, because we do know the statistics, and we'll discuss more of the statistics when it comes to maternal morbidity and infant mortality. So here's an example of how racial disparity and inequities show up. Recently, there was articles that I read and discovered that showed a segregation in the NICU or lack of care for Black babies when it comes to inequities, how treatment was given and the facilities they had access to. And you can look that up here, and I will also provide the link at the end of the webinar for resources on the website. Also, we do know the reality that the CDC highlighted as well is that the access to human milk and human donor milk, specifically in NICUs to Black babies, are far less, and there's a disparity there. These are clinically and statistically significant racial and ethnic disparities between NICUs, and the racial and equity disparity and the segregation comes from the Stanford University School of Medicine in a very large quantitative study. This long history of disparities in healthcare and how healthcare is delivered shows that NICUs are no different than what we already know about Black folks and people of color and how they're treated by the medical community. We want to point out that this also takes place in organizations, and we need to reflect on how do we reduce this? How do we reduce this from happening? What is our responsibility in making sure that we're doing our part in changing the systems and the policy of practices to not have these happen and to change the results of how we're treating communities of color and medical facilities. In this specific instances, it was highlighted that zip codes or hospitals of Black residents were the highest, did not have access or were not given access to human donor milk. As we know that babies, as the Boston Public Health Commission tells us, that babies born to Black women with a college degree are more likely to die the first year of life than babies born to white women that did not finish high school. So many times folks say, oh, well, it's not a race issue. Oh, it's not about class. It's a class issue. Oh, no, it's an education issue. No, we got to name it. We got to call it what it is and call it out. And that's the only way we're going to change and challenge the system and take responsibility for it and say it boils down to race. And again, time and time again, not only individually, but systemically, and research shows that this is the facts. Let's take a look at breastfeeding rates. There is a huge disproportion when it comes to Black infants that are breastfed. And again, although the rates are increasing in Black infants that are breastfed, the gap is widening for the first time. And that's very scary to think about, that for the first time ever, the gap is widening. So what does that tell us? Yeah, we're doing great. We're doing better in the U.S. in terms of promoting breastfeeding, but we're not doing a good job supporting. Because if we were doing a good job supporting, every single rate that we see with Black, white, Asian, Native will all be the same. So we do know those inequities are statistically because of some of the stories and the reasons we are discussing. Recent research also said that Black mothers were 9 times more likely to be given formula in hospitals, which accounts alone for 20%. And that's absolutely disheartening when it comes to duration of Black and white mothers in the hospital. And I can tell you by day 2, Black mothers were more than likely to receive or offer formula than white mothers. From my work done with CHAMPS and what they just published recently was that the huge changes when it comes to this implementing the Step 10 baby-friendly accreditation support that they're doing out in Mississippi, that when they recorded the statistics previously, that there was a huge gap when given skin-to-skin or access to breast milk, mother's own milk. However, when these policies and practices were clear and guided, when the 10 steps were implemented, the racial disparities almost were obsolete. And that is why it's so vital to have practices and policies that have a racial equity lens, because this in itself could really change the demographics of breastfeeding and health outcomes. So we do know that African Americans are 2.2 more likely to have infant mortality rate than non-Hispanic whites. African Americans are 3.2 likely to die from complications such as birth weight compared to non-Hispanic whites. Again, talking about the research that we just discussed in reference to the segregation that takes place can attribute to that. African Americans also had over twice sudden death syndrome mortality rate than non-whites in 2014. And also, African American mothers were 2.2 more likely to receive late or no prenatal care. Let's break it down to colors of skin, because we do know that all communities of colors are impacted by racism and poor care. And statistically, we can see that in different health outcomes, not only infant and breastfeeding, but heart disease, such as African Americans and undocumented immigrants. So as we can see here, immigrants with lightest complexions earn about 8 to 15% more than to those with darkest complexion. And we also know that one shade has about the same effect as an additional year of education. So think about this. And I want to challenge folks, our communities of colors too, Black folks and all communities of color, thinking about this when we're talking about in terms of internal racism and we do know it exists. We don't always talk about it, and how that impacts statistics as well. And thinking about this in terms of systemically, how this talks about or can impact the wealth gap that we all know that's there, and the wage gap that takes place. And we're not even breaking it down gender-wise. We do know disproportionately that exists as well. So let's dig deep into biases. When we talk about biases, typically when we're acting upon them, the unconscious bias, by definition, we're going to use the definition of the Center for Social Inclusion. Unconscious bias is automatic mental shortcuts used to process information to make quick decisions. So such as we're driving down the road, what our immediate response will be, such as we associate stove or fire with hot. So these unconscious biases take place, and we don't even recall, or we might not even understand why. But however, we all carry them. Everyone is susceptible to them. It's how we walk through the world, what we've experienced in our walk. We all carry biases, but we do know that acting upon biases can lead to discrimination, and it can create negative outcomes that are disproportionately for particular groups and targeted groups. So paying attention to that is important, and acknowledging that and being truthful with yourself is vital. Biases can come in terms of explicit and implicit, as we gave the example with laws that from our country previously. Explicit laws would be like Black folks can't drink from this water fountain, or Black folks can't use this bathroom, for instance. Implicit would be Jim Crow laws. Implicit would be biases that may take place in everyday, such as a number of police pulled over as when it comes to demographics, or disproportionately folks killed by police, and the protocols that take place. Those biases, when acted upon, is discrimination. We have to be aware of biases, and when we're aware of them explicitly, and we also think of this as like individual racism or whatnot, when folks may have or call someone racist, or have an experience with explicitly being said, explicit example would be like, oh, I just like whites more than I like Latinos. An implicit example of that would be someone that might walk into a room and sit further away from Latinos, closer to whites. So implicitly, they might not even realize that they're doing that. But explicitly, if it was someone that was verbalizing that, that they prefer whites, we will understand why. So when acting upon the implicit bias, and even the explicit bias, of course, given, that could be racist and determined as how we see and how statistics and differences prevail. So another example would be like, we don't rent to whatever, explicit background choice. Another example would be more criminal backgrounds done on African Americans. I do know that many people are familiar with like resumes or names on resumes example, an extensive research that's done time and time again and proven the folks can have the same exact resume. One resume can have ethnic sounding name, one can have a dominant culture sounding name, and the ethnic sounding name will be called back less or not get the job or the opportunity more than a dominant sounding name, despite the same exact work history, education, and experiences. So most people are overwhelmingly not aware of their unconscious bias, and that is the problem. Again, just like when we're sitting in that airplane listening to the instructions, we don't even realize when they say secure your own mask. We don't even realize when they give us the directions of the exits. We just sit there and unconsciously are not aware of it. And those are biases, just like the biases that we can exhibit when we're practicing and helping our communities of color. Another example of implicit bias, for instance, in the 80s, the orchestra was very interested in increasing female musicians, women musicians, and they were trying really hard in campaigning and marketing to get more women to audition for the orchestra. However, someone thought what about we put a screen in between the person performing and the interviewer and try that way? And so when they implemented this and they put that screen between the interviewer and the musician, they hired 25 to 46 more women in the orchestra. Astronomical. So what they did a step further was that they were wondering if the sound of the shoe was impacted by the decision making of the interviewer. So this time what they did was they still had the screen up. However, they brought the interviewer in last and put the person auditioning in first, so they could not hear the person coming in. And when they did that alone, they increased that same number by 10%. So we do know that although the interviewers, I can imagine, they were trying hard, they wanted women musicians and to see more of them in orchestra, they were being biased, and they acted upon their biases. And this is a big example of it, just like the hiring. So how do we change this? What do we do? How do we secure our own mass? What we have to do is changing biases. Is more importantly changing attitudes, changing behavior, and it's continual. We need to change our mind frame and follow that up with our behavioral change and being conscious of that. And it requires long-term and short-term approaches. Changing biases, it needs to be intentional. We need to have the motivation to change. We need to pay attention to stereotypical responses or how we assume things. And we need time to practice these new strategies and implement them. And I will use myself, for example. So many biases that put into play. For instance, what the example I always give as a clinician is when I first came to the hospital, which I never heard this term in the community, and those that might be in clinical, and why it probably attributes to racism that takes place, is when we hear that Black babies often do better that are born prematurely than white babies. And with that assumption's done, what are we doing, or what was I doing? I had to ask myself when my nurses called me in and stated, "Oh, Felicia, I have a 36-week white baby boy." Or how I would respond to, "Oh, Felicia, I have a 36-week Black baby girl." How would I respond to that differently? Okay, typically what my stereotypical thinking and ways of what I was thinking, or what I acknowledged I did, or and had to pay close attention to, and how we all have to ask ourselves and sit in discomfort and acknowledge that. Was I giving that 36-weeker Black baby girl the same keen skill assessment that I was giving that 36-weeker Black white baby boy? Not sure, but I had to be aware that those, like the stereotypes or the status quo or the things that were said, or the systemic mistreatment that happens, can be a habit that sits in healthcare professionals and could really determine outcomes. So ask yourself, what are those things that I stereotypically respond to and may approach, knowing that this might be a habit that can cause an inequity and an outcome? We have to change individual biases. We have to surface our own assumptions, just like the example I gave you being vulnerable. We have to check our own biases. We have to really commit to equity, not just on paper, not just for grants, not just disparity pimp these grants that many organizations are doing. We need to commit to it in our practices and our trainings, and digging deep, joining groups, doing more, addressing it in our private, safe settings of folks that look like us. Start where communities of colors are by doing better. We have to also build trust. So many times folks say, white clinicians will come up to me like, no matter what I do, I can't get Black women to come to my support group. Why is that? Really? We have to address those biases and those tensions. First, we have to build trust. We have to start with the community priorities. We have to engage in a resource and care about not just that woman's brown breast, but care about how she's going to pay her rent. We need to care about the stressors that take place and that takes place on people of color walking through this world every day. We need to engage and really have a strong influence of our institutions and our organizations, and take this back and demand that these policies are structured in a way that is centering racial equity. With different kinds of racism, most oftentimes when we use the term race, we also think of it of an individual standpoint. But we do know that institutional racism and the policies and practices that happen to discriminate often benefit white folks. unintentionally or inadvertently. Structural racism is the history and the institution of racism that operates together when these systems are combined. And again, all of these kind of work as a well-oiled wheel, as we think of, that when we combine the three, then we this is the problem, and this is the system that we inherit, and that we have to take a responsibility and to dismantle in our approach. So instead of taking things personally, or when I say, or folks might say, oh, you benefit from white privilege. Well, I grew up poor. I don't benefit white. I had to work hard. I had to pull myself up by the bootstraps, blah, blah, blah. However, you may walk through this world white, and you might not have unconsciously realized that you benefit from the system and the structures and the laws that were made to benefit folks that look like you. You do have to acknowledge that the systems that are in place definitely perpetuate racism. If we think about how the system was created and how it impacts negative communities of color, as we say all the time in breastfeeding, facts are not attacks, and these are the facts. And you have to swallow that pill and determine, what am I going to do about this? Okay, I am uncomfortable in this. This is discomfort. I understand that I am, although I feel like I am not a benefit of the system, I do participate in it. And what can I do to make sure that these inequities do not take place? So a tool that I encourage folks to look at and that I love, and I even have to use, is a tool that is created by a Center for Social Inclusion that's research-based, called the ACTU, Affirm, Counter, and Transform. You will also have this link to look at that and examine that, those counseling skills of how we're framing the conversations about race. Many times, folks, especially white people, come to me, well, how do I have a conversation about race at the dinner table? That's so uncomfortable. Or with folks that are my colleagues that are talking about it because they're comfortable about discussing racism or being racist. How do I address it without being confrontational or without feeling like I'm going to be ostracized? I can't promise you won't be ostracized, because like we said, talking about race is always create attention and can be uncomfortable, but we can give you tools and use this tool as a bridge to create those conversations and start normalizing the conversation to have that impact, to remove the barrier, and ideally change the system. So this concludes my presentation to you today. I know it's very short, and hopefully we can have some questions answered, if not in the question box, but by email or reaching out to USBC. This is my child, my oldest child, that I did end up breastfeeding for 18 months that I talked about in the beginning. This is her very first time breastfeeding, and me looking confused, and like many of the families that we help every day. And we figured it out along the way, and she ended up breastfeeding for 18 months. And I ended up really being a change for my family and those that came after me, that continued the breastfeeding, or resumed, because we always did it, but we lost generations of breastfeeding, and resumed our traditions and took back our power in breastfeeding along the line, and I stand on the shoulders of giants. So thank you today for attending this webinar series presented by myself on behalf of NAPLC, and feel free to ask your questions.
Great. Wow. Thank you, Felicia, for that powerful session. Just so much good content in there, and so much for us to think about. Yeah, and as you know, please keep those questions coming, folks. And as we see that with this racial equity series, we have folks at different levels of racial equity learning and practice, and as we learn about how health and health equity is impacted by the social determinants of health, and how structural and systemic barriers are, it's really important to know our nation's history, and to know how all of these policies and systems work together to burden some community groups and benefit some other ones. I would love to hear a little bit more about NAPLC, Felicia. So we know your mission, and this is our first time highlighting this incredibly important and vital organizations. I'm going to pull up, Miriam, can you pull up the website for NAPLC, and we can see their mission as well? And your leader, this organization is so dedicated to building a leaderful movement. So thank you for being at the helm of it, and a founder member, Felicia. Would you be able to share a little bit about some of the work that NAPLC has done? I know during the 2017 Hurricane Harvey, the position statements, your webinar series, there's so much that your organization does.
Yes, I'm honored and proud to stand among my sisters and brothers and those that are here in the walk with us. NAPLC is a grassroots organization, nonprofit, that we really are encouraging folks in the field to join. We're a member-based organization that provides access to skilled lactation support and increased lactation care. As many times we know, being in this field of maternal child health, folks, unfortunately, that don't look like us are often considered the experts and are often teaching us what to do. And we do know traditionally that it's in our DNA to know what to do and how to resolve and take back the power in our own communities. So we developed the Leading by Example webinar, and that webinar is given every other month. And we have leaders from the field of color that are our presenters that talks about their work and how to increase lactation care or community efforts and what's going on, boots to the ground. We also were able to center promotion on discussing the importance of culturally sensitive and cultural humility when it comes to addressing natural disasters, and how imperative that is, and how oftentimes with communities of color and communities of colors, we are disproportionately not served, as we saw with recent hurricane efforts, especially thinking about the one that comes to mind with Lourdes and her efforts being done there, boots to the ground, in Puerto Rico, and how devastating that is. Katrina, and how devastating that was, and how communities of colors often aren't given, and when they are given support, is usually suboptimal. And so we created a statement centering that, because so many times the messaging that is not thought about. We also have a combination of efforts from CGBI out of UNC and NAPLC, where we're called RISE, where we have created and are continuing to develop lactation programs in historically Black colleges and universities, where they can attend these programs and become lactation consultants, or be eligible to test to become a lactation consultant with the requirements met, with HBCUs, again, to increase community skill sets of color, and looking to us to be representatives, because we do know in all career fields across, from every research that's done, role modeling matters. So again, tools and efforts to take back our power, with an example of allyship, an example of collective impact, and how we can do this when we combine organizations. We have done presentations for different organizations, such as Baby Friendly Equity trainings, CGBI and their equity trainings we do. We're going to also be presenting at USLCA. We've been invited to do a 3-hour training there, and again, to discuss and highlight more in detail. This is a very intro hour long, but to highlight in detail what we can do and get some more tools about really changing the language and changing the statistics and bridging the gaps and taking back our power. So NAPLC is a combined efforts of forces that we hope that will continue to be lifelong, generations long, to build power in ourselves and build power in our communities and change the statistics that are disheartening and alarming.
Great. Thank you, Felicia. We're getting lots of comments. This was awesome. Thank you for presenting. Hopefully this will start people discussing the issue of race. One question from Gigi is, fantastic job. What hurdles did you have to overcome personally when you decided to get board certified as IBCLC?
Oh my goodness. Personally, personally in 2012 when I was eligible to test for IBCLC, but then the system changed where I was finally eligible. I've been working since 2006 on my hours, and IBCLE changed the statistics, not the statistics, but the policies and procedures, where you had to have all these college education, all these requirements all of a sudden, and it enabled me to not be able to test. I was ineligible all of a sudden as a person of color. And so it took a few more years to, again, address these systemic changes and barriers that were now in place to become an IBCLC. In 2014, I was able to test and become an IBCLC. And when I was studying for the exam, it was very frustrating because all I saw was white breasts, white babies. I didn't know any lactation consultants of color. I didn't know where we existed. I literally probably stalked Miss Kimmery, Dr. Kimmery Bug, and Jaretha McKinney from Health Connect One, and Dr. Bug from Rose at the time, because those were the only ones that came up in a Google search, and trying to find other folks that looked like me. And because of that frustration and that drive, I also created Blacktivist. It was just a grassroots, just pure grassroots effort of communities of color, Black families sharing pictures of their babies and their families breastfeeding, and it became a need that was highly sought after, because before I knew it, we have now like 40,000 followers and folks pouring in with questions every day. That's grown from that 2014 innocent, like, I just want to look at babies that are brown on the breast, and having that encouragement and drive really helped fuel me to continue to go on to finally test for the exam and pass the exam. I recertified this year, but the systemic barriers are still there, although there are some approaches and some common knowledge that there's a drive in the field of lactation to change that. We still have to think about adequate support and access to lactation care providers and how imperative that is for communities of color. Because when I was breastfeeding my babies, and we're a military family or active duty Air Force family, I could not afford a lactation consultant. We could not fit it in our budget. It was either do that or go without food. So that access to care is very imperative and affects all communities that are disproportionately rural communities, people of color, and how we really need to think about how to systemically address these barriers and consider working together in the collaborative efforts, such as USBC, bringing these collaborative efforts together with the LSP group and trying to address these issues that do exist to help change the field of lactation and the status of disproportionately access to care. So I just want to take this time as an advocacy organization to thank USBC for not only having this webinar series, but really being the change they want to see in leaders in the field, to that to realize that this is important, and when it's centered and when it's done right, it can look beautiful and be a beautiful effort that's collaboratively done together and really change what we have inherited.
Thank you, Felicia. That's really the reality. Erica asks, our past leaders in our organization have not been as culturally congruent and have damaged relationships with the community. What tips do you have as new leaders? How can we renew our relationships?
You know, when damage is done and feelings are hurt, just in any community, just in any relationship, it could be some time to build trust into an effort that it takes to build trust when those relationships are damaged. Because trust, especially for communities of colors, as we know history, people of color don't trust white folks like that, and we do know why. I mean, look at Henrietta Lacks, look at the Tuskegee Airmen, look at any example that we can pull out of history. So communities of color tend to be distrusting, because rightfully so. But when damage is done, it's going to take time, and it's going to take not giving up, and it's going to take self-identification and learning within those that perpetuated the damage, and reflection and accountability in order to do better. So as Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better, and that's what it's going to take. And and if on the other, and you have to be patient, because that forgiveness is a gift. So when that time, if that time is afforded, if that time is given, then do everything in your power to work together alongside, instead of trying to center and drive your own mission. Center the communities of color, center what's important, center your own discomfort, so we won't perpetuate these biases.
So true. Thank you, Felicia. A few more questions, and this, Nikki really affirms what you said about even the curriculum sometimes. What you mentioned, Felicia, that there is such a need for more information and just being able to see brown breasts. And I realize that signs of inflammation, pain, swelling, redness, heat, don't. Sometimes these descriptions and the visuals only apply to white breasts, and we don't get to see how they are with other cultures. And I need to know more, is what Nikki says, and we agree with you, Nikki. Yes.
So true. That is so true. And how we develop that is developing relationships with communities of color, so we can have the trust to gain these pictures and gain access to these pictures, and not just call all lactation providers of color and just ask them for pictures. That is not appropriate, and that is not acceptable. So please don't do that. But it's important to have that relationship so you can build trust and gain access to clinical pictures that can empower everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you. Joel says, great presentation. Suzanne says, terrific presentation. Thank you, Felicia. Oh, she recommends the book White Fragility.
Wonderful.
We have Jessica, who says her local coalition really recently introduced mocha milk cafes in a part of town. She asks if the name is appropriate. She says it feels condescending to her. How would you respond to that, Felicia?
Well, thank you. First, thank you for your efforts and understanding and realizing that there is a disparity there, and the need that it needs to be centered and highlighted. My first question would be, who's leading these efforts? Again, we want to make sure that these efforts are led and organized by folks of color, because we want to make sure that the information given and the space is safe, and the environment is safe, and the information has a lens of cultural humility, and the approach to the folks that we want to attend, or that we want to encourage to attend, have a genuineness to it. So that would be my first question. Who's leading the efforts? Who's alongside you? Is this a community collaboration effort? And if not, then asking yourself those questions. What are we doing where our board or our coalition does not reflect our community? And how are we going to change that?
Absolutely. And lastly, a comment here that too often when, Felicia, you spoke about implicit bias as well as explicit bias, and often in an organization or a coalition or any entity, when there is no outward manifestation of bias, there can be apathy to say that we are all polite with each other, everybody's okay, that because we don't see these explicit manifestations that everything is fine, and how important it is to kind of really have those conversations about how the culture is, how invisible it is, and how sometimes the dominant culture, unwritten norms are centered. And any thoughts on that about organizations wanting to, like you said, you gave us the charge, Felicia, to start today.
Yes.
So if we haven't.
Yes. Many times, and I just talked about this with a few colleagues. Many times, niceness is close to whiteness, and we don't need more nice white people. We need white folks that are going to be willing to sacrifice their reputation, sacrifice their friends, sacrifice how they walk through the world and how they're reflected to change policies and structures. We don't need any more nice white people. Nice white people got us to this place. We need accomplices. We don't need more actors. We need folks that are going to walk alongside us, not in front of us, not behind us, but alongside us, and and build power in communities of color, to help lead efforts and to encourage efforts. And that's not done by being in the front runner. That's done silently. Silent partners are important, and constant support is important without highlighting your efforts. We don't need no, Facebook post or Instagram post saying how nice and white you are in communities of colors. That's inappropriate and it's insulting. So niceness and whiteness are closely aligned. We want to make sure we're messing up the system and changing it and dismantling it appropriately, and the policies and the practices, and calling it out and saying what it is, and having these conversations that are uncomfortable, and growing in that, and challenging where you are, and growing in that place of discomfort, and really honoring that uncomfortableness out loud, and asking humbly, what can I do? How can I learn? The colleague I was having this conversation with was saying that she joined several Facebook groups that was led by people of color, that was aimed to help encourage and raise awareness, and nice white folks, and that has opened her eyes tremendously. And I would encourage those to do so like that. It doesn't always have to be out loud and in front of, and an abstract or a disparity pimp for a grant. It needs to be silent. It needs to be effort done at home in your own backyard. Again, checking your own self, securing your own mask, because you can't go help us and help change communities of colors if you're not even reflecting or looking at yourself in the mirror and your own biases.
Oops, sorry, I guess I was speaking without the audio. I was saying thank you, Felicia, for bringing up the issue of niceness. The civility debate is often not about language or content, it's about power. And there's just, we often in organizations and cultures, we have a tendency to bring up issues when stakeholders of color are angry or outraged, that we think about like the mode or mechanism of how we convey our thoughts and feelings, but often there's just incredible violence in turning one's face away from an issue or not
Exactly.
wanting to, wade into something. There is, and silence can be very, very violent at
Yeah.
times as well when you don't take a stance. So thank you for bringing that issue into this discussion as well.
So many times, I just want to say, so many times when niceness is confronted by people of color, we're often labeled angry, upset, and that's not the case. That's simply not the case. This is a matter of life and death for our community, plain and simple. We are passionate, and that's often confused with being angry or upset, or and competing with or going against niceness. There's no time to be nice because our babies and our families are suffering and dying. So thank you for honoring that. And you're right, silence is violence.
Thank you, Felicia. Lots of comments about, thank you for speaking truth to power. Appreciate your work. We have a recommendation for another book, if I can go there for a second. And then also, someone wanted to, last question now, we have some announcements to make, but there was a question here about it would be nice to know how to any suggestions from your experience, Felicia, about better clinical community linkages, especially hospital WIC linkages.
I just think it's about relationships. I live in a community where we have a very good relationship with WIC, and taking time to go and get to know the peer counselors, taking time to welcome the peer counselors, also understanding how imperative the community support is for duration, and welcoming the community or grassroots efforts into the hospitals, into the clinical skill set. We don't only need to increase clinical skills such as ensuring everyone knows CPR or how to start IVs. We need to know everyone has counseling skills, everyone has some type of racial equity training, everyone understands the importance of grassroots efforts and community efforts, because these are the patients that we're serving live in the communities that are surrounding us, and it should be a bridge. So in step 10 of Baby Friendly, of course, that is a step that's encouraged, and that's why it's there. So it's just about building relationships and taking the time to cultivate those relationships genuinely.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for that. I did have one of our participants, Jareen, had a comment here that was about allies. Educate yourselves. Look at the documentary. So I've put that in the chat box for you all to see. Thank you again, Felicia, for a terrific session. And for those of you who are here live, do know that this recording will be posted again, so you can come back and listen to it again. Please share this session with your peers so that folks can come in and access the recording at their convenience at any time, as many times as you want to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having Appleseed. We're honored to present and continue to work with collaborative efforts with all organizations and have that collective impact. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Appleseed and to the entire team, and Stacy, the executive director, and Felicia as board president. Thank you so much. We have just a quick update on USBC. And is Camille on the line, or would Miriam be speaking about this? Miriam, do you want to share the NBCC update, please?
Sure. We just have this page up here to let everyone know that registration is now open for our conference that will be held June 14th and 15th in Bethesda, Maryland. For more information on registration, preliminary programs, exhibits, and marketing info, hotel info, and a lot of frequently asked questions are available on the website, which we can share the link. And make sure to stay updated and get connected by following our Facebook page.
Fabulous. Thanks, Miriam. And again, thank you to Felicia for a terrific session. Let's keep the conversation going on the learning community. We didn't get to every single question that was asked, so we hope that we can continue this in the discussion forum. If you have resources, we'd love to see them as well and share them with our network. And until next time, thank you.